The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, every corner glowing with wealth and celebration, yet I stood quietly near the far wall, almost invisible among the elegantly dressed guests who laughed freely and clinked their glasses in honor of my son Ayaan's success. My fingers nervously held the edge of my old shawl, a piece of fabric that had seen more struggle than luxury, but tonight I had worn it with pride because this was not just any evening, it was the night my son had reached a height I once only dreamed of for him, and despite everything, despite the years of hardship, I had made it here to witness his moment, even if I didn't quite belong in this glittering world. I watched him from a distance, my heart swelling as he moved confidently through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling, laughing like someone who had never known the weight of hunger or the sting of sacrifice. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to forget the past and simply be a mother proud of her child. Because this was the same boy who once held my hand tightly as we crossed busy streets, the same boy who cried when he fell and ran into my arms for comfort, the same boy I had raised alone after life took everything from us. I remembered the nights I stayed awake stitching clothes under dim light, the mornings I left early to clean houses that were never mine, the countless times I pretended I wasn't hungry so he could have a full meal, and every memory wrapped itself around my heart as I stood there, watching the result of all those sacrifices come alive in front of me. Then suddenly the room grew quieter as someone tapped a glass, drawing everyone's attention to the stage, and Ayaan stepped forward, straightening his expensive suit, holding the microphone with the confidence of a man who had finally arrived, and the applause that followed was loud, overwhelming, almost deafening. But I barely heard it because all I could focus on was him, waiting, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would look toward me, that his eyes would find me in the crowd, and in that silent exchange I would feel seen, acknowledged, remembered. But he didn't. His gaze passed over me like I was just another stranger in the room. And still I smiled, convincing myself it didn't matter because what mattered was his happiness. He began to speak, thanking his colleagues, his friends, the people who had supported him along the way. And with every word my chest filled with anticipation, my heart whispering, "He will mention you. He hasn't forgotten." But then his tone softened and he turned toward a man standing proudly in the front row, a man dressed in authority and wealth, a man I knew too well, his father-in-law, Mr. Rahman, and in that moment something inside me shifted, a quiet unease creeping into my chest as Ayaan's voice grew warmer, more emotional. "I wouldn't be here today without my father-in-law," he said, and the crowd nodded in approval, some even clapping lightly, but I stood frozen, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and denial, telling myself he would say more, that he would correct it, that he would remember me next. But instead he continued, his voice steady and filled with gratitude. "He is the man who truly raised me and taught me everything I know." And just like that, the ground beneath me seemed to disappear. The applause that followed echoed like a cruel joke, loud and proud, while inside me everything collapsed into silence. My ears rang, my vision blurred, and my hands trembled as those words repeated in my mind, truly raised me, as if the years I had spent breaking myself to build his future meant nothing, as if my existence had been erased with a single sentence. And still he spoke, smiling, confident, unaware of the storm he had unleashed within me. He gave me the life I deserved. And that was when the pain cut deepest, because I knew what kind of life I had given him, not perfect, not easy, but honest, built on love and sacrifice, not wealth and convenience. And yet in his eyes, it seemed that life had not been enough. I looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who might notice me, who might see the woman standing there trying not to fall apart, but no one did. Their attention was fixed on him, on his success, on the story he had chosen to tell, a story where I had no place. And slowly, quietly, I stepped back, blending further into the shadows until I reached the exit, my footsteps light, almost careful, as if making noise would somehow confirm that I existed, and I wasn't ready for that truth yet. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, and for a moment I stood there, staring at the bright lights inside the hall through the glass doors, watching as the celebration continued without me, as if I had never been part of it to begin with. And I realized then that the pain I felt wasn't just from what he said, but from what he didn't say, from the silence where my name should have been, from the absence of a mother in a story that would not exist without her. And as I turned away, walking slowly into the darkness, I understood something that broke me even more deeply than his words ever could, that sometimes the people you give your entire life to are the very ones who forget you the easiest. And that night, As I disappeared into the quiet streets alone, carrying years of love that suddenly felt invisible, something inside me shattered so completely that I knew, no matter what happened next, I would never be the same again. The next morning, the small, modest house felt heavier than usual, its walls echoing memories I could no longer ignore, the smell of aged wood and faint incense wrapping around me like a ghost of the past. And I sat at the warm kitchen table, my hands clutching a chipped cup of tea that had long since gone cold, staring blankly at the steam that had once seemed so comforting but now rose like a mocking reminder of the warmth I had poured into a life that seemed to have forgotten me. The sunlight filtered weakly through thin curtains, casting long shadows across the floor, shadows that reminded me of the long nights I had spent awake, sewing torn clothes by candlelight while my stomach gnawed at emptiness. Of the mornings I left the house before dawn to scrub floors, wash dishes, and clean homes that would never thank me, all to give Ayaan a future I could barely imagine for myself, and as I sat there, memories collided with regret and a sharp, aching pride, because he had grown into this man before me, confident, successful, and yet blind to the sacrifices that had shaped every step he had taken. I thought of his father, a man whose absence had defined my every choice. A man who had died so long ago yet whose memory lingered like a soft, persistent ache, not because he abandoned us willingly, but because he had chosen the impossible for the sake of honor and love, taking blame for a crime he never committed to protect someone far more powerful than him, and that someone, Mr. Rahman, had walked free, built his empire, and now stood as the center of Ayaan's gratitude, the man Ayaan claimed had raised him, the man whose hands had never changed diapers, whose voice had never soothed fevered cries, yet whom my son saw as the architect of his life, leaving me invisible, unacknowledged, and burning with a mixture of sorrow and rage I barely recognized. I thought of the letters I had hidden, the court documents I had buried deep in a drawer, letters my husband had sent from prison, explaining the truth, letters I had never shown to Ayaan, wanting to shield him from the bitterness, wanting him to grow untainted, to flourish without hatred in his heart. But now those letters felt like relics of a life I had sacrificed silently while the world celebrated another man's cunning and survival, and the injustice of it all sat like a stone in my chest, heavy and unmovable, as I realized that all those years of quiet endurance, all those sleepless nights, had built nothing in Ayaan's eyes, nothing except the narrative constructed by someone else, someone who had manipulated fate while I had simply tried to survive. I remembered the nights I had whispered to myself in the dark, telling myself that someday he would understand, someday he would know, but that day had not arrived, and instead, the world had seen him honor a man who had taken what was never his to take, and in that thought, my grief hardened into something colder, something sharper, the beginnings of a fire that would not consume me but would forge a path toward truth, toward the reckoning I had silently dreamed of while wearing smiles for a child who now no longer saw me. I ran my fingers over the table, tracing the grooves and scars as though they contained the stories of our survival, stories Ayaan had grown up with but never learned to read, and I realized how alone I had been in carrying the burden of history, of morality, of a love so fierce it had broken me silently, while allowing him to believe he owed his life to someone else, and that realization stung more than the party, more than the words, more than any lie or betrayal, because it meant that love, in its purest form, had been ignored, had been invisible, had been replaced by the cleverness of another man's deceit, and yet, in that silence, in the crushing weight of years unrecognized, I began to feel the stirrings of a plan, a quiet, patient resolve that I had never allowed myself before, a recognition that if the world could rewrite history with ease, so too could truth be revealed with care, and that perhaps the moment had come when Ayaan, the boy who once clung to my skirts in fear of shadows, would have to confront the reality of who truly had shaped his life, who had sacrificed everything for him without expectation, without acknowledgement, without applause. I sipped the bitter tea, letting it burn my throat, and in that burn I found clarity, the painful understanding that revenge was not about malice, not about breaking others as I had been broken, but about revealing truth, about letting the scales balance where they had long been tipped by wealth, influence, and cowardice. And I understood that this was my gift and my burden, the legacy of a woman who had given her all to a child who had failed to see her, and perhaps it was time for that child to see, for him to feel the depth of what had been given and lost, for him to stand in the quiet shadow of history. and recognized the woman who had never faltered even when the world had, and as I sat there in the dim morning light, clutching my cup like a talisman against despair, I realized that the story had not ended with that party, that the night of betrayal was only the beginning of a reckoning that would be long, deliberate, and perhaps sweet in its justice. And though tears blurred my vision, I felt the first flicker of strength returning, a strength tempered by grief, hardened by betrayal, and sharpened by love, the same love that had built a life for Ayaan in the absence of everything else. And in that moment, amidst the silence of my empty kitchen, I promised myself that the truth would rise, that Ayaan would know, and that the man who had stolen my husband, my years, my recognition, would finally face the consequences of the choices he had forced upon us. Days passed after that morning of silent despair, the world outside continuing in its careless rhythm while I remained in the quiet of my home, replaying every word, every glance, every absence, until finally there came a knock at the door, hesitant, almost trembling, and when I opened it, I saw him, my son Ayaan, not the confident, polished man who had spoken at the party, but a version I barely recognized, his suit wrinkled, eyes red-rimmed, cheeks pale, hands shaking as if the weight of the world had finally caught up with him, and he simply whispered, "Amy," the single word carrying decades of distance, misunderstanding, and loss. And in that instant my chest constricted with a mixture of relief and pain, because he had come, but he had come broken. The image of the boy I once held in my arms now reflected in the tear-streaked face of a man too proud to admit fault until the world forced him to, and I said nothing, letting him sink to his knees on the cold floor as though kneeling could somehow undo years of neglect, betrayal, and ignorance. He buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs, and I stood silently, watching, feeling a twisted combination of anguish and vindication as he finally confronted a reality he had so long ignored, and when he raised his tearful eyes to me, he choked out, "I made a mistake. I didn't know, please forgive me," the words jagged, full of regret, and I could see every ounce of guilt pressed into his posture, the shame that had finally broken through the armor of arrogance he wore for the world. And I asked softly, almost cautiously, "What didn't you know?" Because I wanted to hear it from him, wanted to measure whether the weight of truth had truly reached his soul, and he swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper, "About Abu, about Mr. Rahman, about everything. I found the documents, the old case files, letters. Abu didn't commit that crime, he took the blame for him," and I felt my heart tighten, the pain of memory rising with each syllable as he continued, the confession tumbling out like water breaking through a dam, and I thanked him, I called him my father, in front of everyone, and the tears streamed freely now, his body shaking as though purging years of ignorance and misplaced gratitude in a single cathartic moment. While I remained still, absorbing the intensity of his remorse, the weight of realization pressing down on both of us, and I finally spoke, my voice calm but firm, "Do you know why I never told you?" And he shook his head, uncertainty and fear mingling in his expression, and I continued, "Because I didn't want you to grow up broken like me," the words heavy, deliberate, and he lowered his gaze, the tears still flowing but his lips pressed in a thin, uncomprehending line, and then his voice cracked, raw and desperate, "I don't deserve you, Amy. I betrayed you. I betrayed Abu," and the repetition of guilt hung between us, a palpable fog of regret and recognition, as I simply looked at him, letting the silence do the work words could not, and he buried his face again, the sobs wrenching but necessary, the truth finally landing in his soul with a force I had long feared would never come, and I felt a strange mix of sorrow and quiet satisfaction, knowing that the reckoning had begun, that the first steps toward acknowledgement, toward understanding, were unfolding right before me, and I said gently, "Sorry doesn't rebuild a mother's heart," the words soft, precise, carrying the weight of every lonely night, every sacrifice, every unrecognized effort, and he flinched, understanding the gravity of what had been lost, of what he had failed to see, and yet despite the anger, the pain, the years of being invisible in the eyes of the one person he should have known, I remained still, letting him confront his shame fully, knowing that this confrontation, this raw, unfiltered admission, was the first step toward redemption, and slowly, painfully, he raised his head, eyes glistening with remorse and fear, meeting mine with a vulnerability that mirrored my own, and I could see in that gaze the beginnings of comprehension, the first spark of a realization that the world was not as he had imagined it, that gratitude misplaced could wound more deeply than any betrayal, and that he had been blind to the truth of his father's sacrifice. of the lies that had been fed to him by a man whose influence had overshadowed decades of love, toil, and devotion, and as he whispered again, almost a broken prayer, I want to make it right. I want to be worthy. I don't know how to fix this. I simply watched, my chest aching with the complexity of emotions that surged through me, pain, anger, relief, a strange, budding hope. And I understood that the path to reconciliation would be long, difficult, and wrought with lingering shadows, but for the first time in years, the distance between us felt bridgeable, the walls we had built through misunderstanding and unspoken truths beginning to crack under the weight of honesty, and I realized that his tears, his confession, his kneeling before me, were not just signs of regret but the first trembling steps toward humility, toward seeing me as the woman who had truly shaped his life, not the man he had praised at that glittering party. And though the room remained quiet, heavy with emotion, I felt a subtle shift, a moment suspended between past grievances and the possibility of healing. And I let him weep, I let him struggle, because that was the beginning, the moment where the scales could start to tip, and in the soft ache of my own heart, I recognized that this confrontation, raw and imperfect, was the foundation upon which our future, fragile and tentative, would be rebuilt. Days turned into weeks after that confrontation, and the world outside moved on. But inside our small home, a slow, deliberate shift began to take place, a transformation neither of us had expected, because the truth, once hidden, had a way of spreading, seeping into corners that were long ignored, and soon, whispers of the scandal surrounding Mr. Rahman began to surface, subtle at first, hints in financial circles, murmurs among business partners who had once lined up to support him, and then the floodgates opened, documents leaked, investigations reopened, and the empire he had built on lies and manipulation started to tremble under the weight of exposure, while Ayaan, who had once basked in that world, now turned away from the wealth, the connections, and the hollow applause that had so long blinded him, walking instead toward me, toward the truth that had been my companion through years of struggle. And one evening, he came home not as the man who begged for forgiveness but simply as my son, tired, humbled, stripped of pretense, sitting quietly beside me as though he had returned to the boy who once clung to my skirts in fear and trust, and I felt a strange, cautious warmth at having him near, feeling the weight of both relief and lingering hurt that had defined our relationship for too long, because love alone had not shielded him from ignorance, and forgiveness alone could not erase the years he had been blind to sacrifice, yet in his presence, I sensed a beginning, a fragile step toward balance, and he finally spoke, voice low and steady, I can't undo what I did. I can't take back the words, the party, the praise, but I want to spend the rest of my life earning back even a fraction of what I lost, earning back your trust. And I looked at him, really looked, seeing the raw sincerity in his eyes, the trembling remorse that no luxury or status could hide, and I realized that revenge, the kind I had nurtured quietly, had already begun. Not as an act of malice or cruelty but as the careful unveiling of truth, letting the man who had stolen my husband, my recognition, and my son's misplaced gratitude finally face the consequences of his choices, the world turning its gaze on him while I remained steadfast, my quiet resilience finally visible in the contrast of his unraveling, and as I watched, I understood that the sweetest revenge was never in confrontation, never in shouting or striking back, but in patience, in letting time, truth, and revelation do the work that anger alone could not accomplish, and Ayaan's presence, humble, sincere, and unassuming, became a testament to that, because here was the boy I had raised, now grown, yet finally recognizing the depth of what had shaped him, what had been denied in his eyes for far too long. And as he reached out and gently held my hand, a gesture so simple yet so profound, I felt the years of silence, of invisibility, begin to ease, because acknowledgement, even tentative, had a power more potent than wealth, more enduring than any empire built on deceit, and I allowed myself a quiet smile, the first in years that was entirely for me, for the mother who had endured, who had persevered, who had loved without expectation. Because the reckoning had not only come for Rahman but for my son as well, for both of us to confront the layers of loss, betrayal, and ignorance that had defined our lives. And as he continued, voice barely above a whisper, I want to rebuild, not just for me, not just for the world, but for us. I want to be worthy of the love you gave me all these years. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a recognition that though wounds remained, healing could begin, slowly, deliberately, and not through grand gestures or public displays, but through quiet actions, presence, acknowledgement, and time spent rebuilding trust, and I nodded, letting the silence fill the space between us, letting it speak where words might fail, because I knew that every tear he had shed, every moment of remorse, every unspoken apology, was a brick in the foundation of a renewed relationship, a bond tempered by fire, sorrow, and truth. And though I was not fully healed, though the past still lingered like shadows along the walls of our hearts, I felt hope stir, fragile but insistent, that one day, Ayaan would not only understand the magnitude of his father's sacrifice but also see the unyielding love of a mother who had given everything without expectation, and that realization, more than anything else, became the sweetest revenge, watching lies crumble, watching a man who had stolen so much confront his own culpability, watching my son step away from misplaced loyalty and toward the truth, and finally, sitting there in the quiet of our home, hand in hand with the child-turned-man who had once ignored me, I realized that the victories I had longed for were not in wealth or recognition but in this reclaimed space of honesty, and the soft reconnection of hearts. And as Ayaan's hand tightened around mine, a small, tentative squeeze that spoke volumes, I allowed myself to breathe, to feel, to know that justice had been served not with destruction, but with revelation, not with hatred, but with truth. And in that moment, under the dim glow of the evening lamp, I understood fully that life, long tested by betrayal, could still offer redemption, love, and the quiet, unshakable triumph of being seen, of being acknowledged, and of finally being understood by the one who mattered most.